You are listening to the Get Global podcast, a weekly journey into the international business landscape with leaders, knowers, and doers from around the world who share their stories and insights on the issues that matter most. Get Global brings you the best to help you thrive in foreign markets. Welcome to the Get Global podcast. I am Julian Luthold, the CEO and founder of Get Global. And this week we are focusing on India and India's women and the vast amount of change that's going on in the country and some of the key areas to watch as foreigners and domestic watchers monitor the what I think is one of the most fascinating transformations in the world right now. Joining us today, we have Anuradha Das Mathur. She runs the Vedika Scholars Program for Women based in Delhi, which is an MBA program just for young women that caters to their personal and professional needs. She's also a senior advisor at Albright Stonebridge Group, which is the corporate diplomacy firm, a partner of Get Global. She is also a founder of 9.9 Media, which is a fast-growing niche media company focused on business, and she focuses on various aspects, which she'll discuss in a moment. But she also ran Business World, and it is one of India's most widely read business magazines. And for how long, Anuradha, with the Economist Group?
I was with the Economist for almost 13 years.
Yes. So thank you for joining us, Anuradha. And I knew that it was quite a while, but I didn't want to get the number wrong. So also joining us today is Anirudha Dutta, who is an analyst and author. He wrote Half a Billion Rising to critical acclaim. It is about India's young women and the transformation going on with them, focusing on young women, but also on mothers and women in general. He included plenty of data and analysis in his work and toured India for nearly 2 years, gathering anecdotal evidence to help tell the story. He is also, Anirudha, why don't you say hello to us here?
Hi, Julian. Hi, Anuradha. It's a pleasure to be here.
Hi.
Doing this.
Yes, thank you both for joining us. So it's been an intense few months. There's been lots of talk of gender in India with several high-profile stories. They're complicated stories. Won't get into that quite as much, but suffice to say, it's a hot issue again, discussing the meaning of women in Indian society today, and it keeps coming up. At Davos this year, Christine Lagarde mentioned that India's GDP would grow by 27% if women were brought to the same level as men in the economy. And hot off the presses, I think just 3 days ago, McKinsey just came out with a report that said that India could add up to $770 billion, more than 18% of its economy, to its GDP by 2025 by giving equal opportunities to women. And although there are disparities in gender and equality and participation and access, there are bright spots. There have been female leaders in India in both state and central governments, many corporations, lots of women in banking, and so there are these bright spots that in some ways India is doing better than many countries in the developed world, including the United States. So it's a complex topic, one with deep roots, and I'm really thrilled to have you both to help us make sense of where women are today, where have they come from, and where are they going. Anuradha, could you give a brief assessment of women in India's economy today? What do you see from your posts, in your many posts at Vedika, Albright Stonebridge, and 9.9?
Right. Thanks, Julian. It's a pleasure to be on this podcast. You just mentioned why this issue is back on the radar, and the fact that while there are lots of complex issues to deal with, both in India and worldwide, there are also bright spots. And I think that's a perfect segue into how I actually see a lot of these issues, because most conversations around women in India have traditionally been about women as victims. And, the things that catch the news are almost always issues that are problems that need to be solved. And we think we're at a stage in this society where we are very well poised to start a parallel conversation about women as assets. This is about women as economic agents, women with economic agency, women who are educated, and some of the things that you said, what they can contribute, and then sort of draw to the fact that there are things that are coming in the way of them being at full potential, and what can we do to change that. But very quickly, I'll tell you how I personally got involved in this space and why Vedika is an important intervention in this country and in the world. That traditionally, it has been believed that education was the answer to everything. And if women had to be independent and empowered, then we should educate our women. Now, this is not to take away from the fact that women must get educated. But in India, over the last couple of decades, education has made great strides. Women's enrollment in primary education is almost the same as men. In higher education, women are 44% or 45% of enrollments. They do incredibly well in competitive exams. But in the decades that women's enrollment and participation and performance in education has been going up, we have had the absolute bizarre phenomena of urban educated women in the workforce reducing as a part of women in society, reducing as a part of the workforce. The World Bank recently published a report which says that in 2000, India had 34% women as a part of the workforce. Today, that number is 23%. So the truth is that education is not going to ensure empowerment and financial independence for women. If women have to be in the workforce, what we are seeing very clearly is that there are things other than their skill education that are coming in the way of women continuing to stay in the jobs that they get. So they're very competent at getting good jobs, but they're not able to retain them. And we are focused on making sure that not only do you have the competencies to be a good performer workforce, you are also equipped with everything that is required to negotiate space for yourself. There are lots of pulls from the corporate world. People have diversity targets. People want more women in the workforce, partly because of economic reasons, partly because of social responsibility, partly just because you.
There you are. Okay.
Yeah.
So to pick up from some of the themes that you're discussing here, what are some of the soft things that are holding women back, either socially or culturally? There's an element of personal belief and making space for themselves, and that comes from their own decision making. The role that Vedika plays in shaping that and helping that. What is it that exists in the outer world today, and what are young women doing about it?
So I think patriarchy is very deep-rooted, Julian, and it's deep-rooted both amongst men and women. The McKinsey Global Institute did a piece of research in India, and they said that both men and women believe that when jobs are scarce, men should have more right to a job than a woman. There was also prevalent beliefs that when other works for pay, children suffer. Now, when that's the prevailing mindsets, of course, we have a big battle ahead of us. There are other issues like disproportionate responsibility for unpaid care at home. The global average is 3 times. Women do 3 times as much work in the home than men. In India, that's close to 10%. It's actually 9.8 to be precise. Right? There is early marriage for girls. all of those things. But I want to actually just take away from that, because these are all large social problems that are unwinding and changing even as we speak. There are measures that we can take to catapult that change and make the impact faster and larger and more spread. So some of the softer issues that we have started to focus on, and it is one part of one of the strongest modules at Vedika, is, we took our cue from what's going on across the world in terms of higher education, executive education for women. There are lots of women's only executive education programs that have come up in the last decade or so. They are very highly subscribed. They are growing by leaps and bounds across the world. And we spent a little bit of time thinking why that was happening. The world of work is actually not the same for men and women. We may want to be equal, but we are not the same. Until such time that we can uncondition large parts of the population across the world, both men and women, we have to find a way to navigate the world that we live in as we speak. And research shows that women struggle with visibility, networking, presence, negotiations, assertiveness, all of the kinds of things that are appreciated in the workplace, directness. And there's a very interesting concept called the double bind, that the things that get women ahead in the workforce actually hit them quite negatively in the domestic space. So how do you actually work through some of these things? And what we have done is, executive education is normally kept or reserved for women, who are doing very well already, have survived staying in the workforce till their mid-30s. They're identified as high performers, and they're the ones who are put through these programs. Now, our belief is that instead of waiting to make your mistakes and then, start to rectify them or get support for them, if we were to pick up all of these things and equip women before they join the workforce, first, help them anticipate that the world of work will be different. 2, that they are equal but not the same as men. And, there are things that they are good at. There are things that men are good at. The workplace was designed by men. And so traditional strengths, I don't want to use the word traditional, but conditioned strengths of women, and perhaps some natural ones, actually don't get the advantages that they should deliver to women in the workplace. So we have incorporated into our course design all of these things for these young women, so that when they get into the workforce, they understand how to play to their strengths and are able to navigate the workplace before it becomes tough for them to cope and they fall out.
So is there, did you take these programs that you've been watching so closely and absorb them into India, sort of just the way that they were, or was there some modification that you had to do for your audience?
Issues like negotiation skills, assertiveness, visibility, networking, presentation, these are fairly standard skills. The way they are taught for executive education for women, who are senior, all we've done is adapted them to a much younger audience. But the principles behind them and the way they are taught are very much the same.
So, Anirudha, do tell about your book. It's been out now for, I think it came out in 2015. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you did some touring. You've spoken about it a lot. It's a fascinating topic, because especially the research that you did, it opened your eyes to some stories that were going on in rural India that were pretty important to the overarching narrative of the book. A little bit about all of this. What did you see? What did you learn? And what do you take away from it?
Right. And thank you, Julian, once again. It's a pleasure to be here. And even before I get into my book and what did I see and what did I learn, let me start with where Anuradha started about this conversation about women as assets. And being an analyst, let me throw in a few numbers. and as which I found in the course of writing my book and subsequently even now every day as I go about doing my work. First is 2011 census revealed a very interesting number, which was the additional literate women at 105 million was more than the 98 million additional men for the first time. This was a job which has been widening since independence. It was bad, it became worse. And now I think finally we are at a stage where we have started closing the gap. And Anuradha referred to that. The number of girls who are now in primary education, who go into secondary schooling, and then who go on to higher education and do well. I mean, this gap closing, I think, is a big deal. We know about the challenges in India's education outcome, but nevertheless, this is a very, very positive move forward. Let me give you some other numbers, which are on the other side of it. One is that we all know that the IIT joint entrance exams are one of the toughest exams, probably anywhere. One of the toughest institutes to get in, given the sheer size of India's population and the aspiration that people have. Now, for some time and quite a few years, about a third of the exam writers are women, young girls. And while this proportion was always for a long time stagnant at about 12 or 15%, it just got a boost up to a third when the government of India actually made the application fee free. Now, proportionately, admissions haven't gone up, unfortunately, but there's a slow trend of increasing increase that you can see out there. Let's take the other spectrum of it. I was in this eastern state of Orissa recently, which is one of the more backward states. It's a poor state. It actually now today supplies labor to the more developed states, along with states like West Bengal, UP, Bihar, etc. And I found something very interesting out there. In the Orissa Skill Development Authority programs, in last 2 years, the number of young girls who are participating and graduating has gone up from 6% to 14%. More than twice. And the target that they have now kept after achieving this is 20% in the next 2 years. Their largest partner for OSDA in Orissa is ILFS. And ILFS is also one of the largest skill development agencies in the country. Overall in the country, about 49% of the training graduates are women. And they've trained about 1.6 million youngsters over the last, since about a decade. And in Orissa, the proportion of young women who are getting trained are about 54% of the graduating class. These are significant changes. Coming back to people like us, you look at the Nifty 500 board, for example, the 500 companies in the Nifty, which are the largest corporates in India. About 13% of the directors are women. This came because there was a mandated by regulation, therefore 13%. But what is more interesting is most people believe, looking at some of the largest companies, that most of these directors probably are relatives, wives, mother, or sister, etc., etc. But actually, no, 60% of those women are actually independent directors. So I think there's a huge change going around, and I completely agree with Anuradha on that. We need to have more of these conversations. We need to put more of these role models in the public domain and talk and celebrate them more so that young girls can look up to the role models. Because in my experience, what happens when you get into the challenge sections of the socio-economic strata of this society, the youngsters, both men and both boys and girls, lack role models. And what they see in their immediate surrounding is something that is not very encouraging. To come back to my book, the question that you asked, what did I see, what did I learn, etc. There were some very discerning or very, very clear trends that I could see. One was I could see across the country and rural India, small town, metro, of course, a very confident, assertive and aspirational young women who were also willing to stand up for their rights and beliefs. They were resisting the patriarchal beliefs that are there in the society. And as Anuradha mentioned, that's probably the biggest bottleneck to change in this country and the status of women. And therefore, what we really need is a deep social change is necessary in terms of social attitudes, and which would be very long drawn. but the girls are standing up. They're standing up to the patriarchal beliefs. They're resisting it. For example, look at a few things. In a state like Haryana, which is known for probably it has got the worst gender ratio in this country, and even out there now, girls are resisting the diktats of the Khap Panchayat, for example, which says, oh, you cannot wear jeans or you cannot be given mobile phones, etc. Encouragingly, in the last few years, the governments have a lot of fault, but they seem to be kind of encouraging women's participation in different areas, or at least trying to encourage the girl child in public space with small initiatives. Like, for example, in the Republic Day program, which is held in every school, the invitation from the school has gone in the name of the girl child to the parents. Small things like that, done over a long period of time, can help. So that's one thing which is happening. You look at the sports, for example, the number of young girls who are now coming out of Haryana. It's encouraging. Those are the right role models to be celebrated. The other area where they are resisting, and we can debate whether that's the right area to resist or not, is, for example, or demand, for example, is places of religious worship, whether it's among Hindus or Muslims, where in many cases women are not allowed. Like down south, then there's something in Maharashtra, there's a well-known dargah out here in Mumbai. Over the last 2 years, I have seen that women have come out and started protesting and demanding their equal right to go there. And in many of these cases, they're winning their rights. That's change. And that's big change in this country if you look at it. What I've also noticed during my travels and the study that I did for the book and the research was the small town metro rural India gap is rapidly converging. Probably the small town metro is converging more rapidly, but even in rural India, you can see the same changes. Some of it gets manifested in terms of the attire young women and girls wear, in the way they converse with a stranger. And that was my eureka moment. I remember in it was early 1990s probably. I was in somewhere in the hills. I wanted to take a picture of a middle-aged lady who was washing utensils in there, and she shooed me away and covered her face. And I had asked her for a permission. Now, when I travel into villages, that's never a problem. And it's amazing how things have changed. And at the same point of time, it was kind of interesting to see that how mature some of these young girls are. The battles that they're choosing to fight, they're very, very carefully choosing it. And of course, all this means the resistance to patriarchy, etc., is the other side of it is clearly the resistance from men. And whether it's the Khap Panchayat, whether it's some of violence against women, etc., we will see some of that rise. So there's a tussle out here going on right now. The society is in churn. But overall, for me, the narrative was very positive. From the numbers that I saw, some of the numbers that I gave you earlier when I started off, and the anecdotes from the girls that I spoke to was simply amazing and very, very encouraging. What did I learn? Actually, my eyes opened up a lot. I mean, I thought I traveled a reasonable bit and I speak to people, etc., But for example, I hadn't realized how deep-rooted is this patriarchal feeling against the girl child. And I always thought when I was growing up, this is to do with primarily with dowry, the practice of giving, demanding groom money, if I may say so. And I realized it's more to do with division of property, land and businesses in the northern states rather than the practice of dowry. And this kind of, when you look at a state like Gujarat, it is neutral as far as religious divisions are concerned. It's like, just across the entire society, it's the same thing. It was a shocker to me. What also shocked me is I thought...
Could you explain a little bit more about that? What are some of the peculiarities of that were surprising to you?
As I said, I thought that many parents feel that the girl child is a burden because she will not be there to care for them, whereas the male child is where they will stay in their old age. Plus, they will have to spend a lot of money for the girl child's marriage because of the practice of dowry, where the groom can demand the groom's family, and the girl's family, more often than not, gives a lot of physical goods as well as cash, etc., to the groom's family or the groom himself. And this practice obviously got distorted over a period of time where it could, be a huge amount of stress on a girl's family. And but what I realized, what I heard, and which I also verified with more conversations later on, is it's more to do with the division of a property. Suppose I have a family with some land, and if the girl gets married into another family, and if I have to give her an equal right to the property, then that land will go out of my family into another family. And same holds true for a business. What I haven't done and correlated, which some point of time I would like to do, is that when the Indian law changed towards giving equal inheritance rights to the girl child, did the practice from then on worsen or not? That would be a good data correlation from my perspective, which I haven't done, albeit. But this is I've consistently heard from various people in Haryana, in Punjab, Rajasthan, Gujarat, etc. So I pretty much trust those anecdotes. So that was one. The other one, as I said, was how much some traditions are ingrained. For example, all the young girls that I spoke to said, we would like to, marry a boy or a man when the time comes who is more qualified than what we are. They wanted their husbands or partners to share household chores, but they said, when I come back from office, I will never expect him to fetch me a glass of water. And these response, it just tells you that certain, beliefs or certain practices are so deeply ingrained, it will take a long time to change.
There are certain things that seem to be changing a lot, and I'm curious about what you both think of them. I go back to India about twice a year, and something that really surprised me this time was hanging out with some of my friends in their late 20s, female, asking them, what's going on with dating, what's going on with marriage, is it something that's good, at the top of their minds. A lot of them said no. They were focused on work, they were focused on making their own money, starting their own companies, and doing well. And when I asked them a little bit more about it, the stereotype or the common narrative is that the parents are putting pressure, and there's constant questions. And what really surprised me was that there was none of that. Maybe the father would make a comment every now and then, but mostly the mother was instigating professionalism in their daughter. That was very surprising to me, and especially when I take a step back, and I there are lots of countries where there are these ongoing debates. Is our culture really changing, or is it just expressing long-running stories in different ways? What do you think is, in light of that, and in light of the data that you're telling me and the stories that you're relaying, is India changing? And if so, how? And if not, how?
Anuradha, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. I think the first thing is that I do want to pick on one of the things that you said, Anirudh, but before that, there isn't one India, Julian.
Sure.
So no.
These are urban Indians India. For sure. Yeah.
So, and urban is again very large, and urban and rural. I'm going to just take a second to explain to you that within Delhi, there are lots of pockets that are classified as rural, right? Because these were pockets in the past that are not part of the urban agglomeration. Having said that, that means nothing in terms of mindsets and attitudes and things like that. So I do think that there is just different segments of the population that are changing at different paces, but I'm not sure how you can segment them, because it's very hard for anything to feel completely true, given that every segment in itself is diverse and large. I do want to take 1 second to comment on some of the things that Anirudh said about, what's happening in, let's say, Haryana and Panchayats and all of that. I want to give you some anecdotes from Vedika. We've had 3 batches now. I must have interviewed more than 500 young women over these last 3 years, but more importantly, also engaged with their parents. talking about changing mindsets. Girls take loans for their management program. Families need to take loans. Sometimes they will save money because they need to provide for their son's higher education. Having said that, we have never had a parent say, I need to save for my daughter's marriage and therefore I cannot pay the fee. Now, is that not still patriarchal? Of course it is, because what happens is that when boys are brought up believing that they have to provide for their families, for their spouses, for their children, for their parents, all of that, and therefore the need to make them financially secure and independent is much bigger than the fact that girls need to do the same thing. It's very, I don't want to call it unfortunate, but it's the truth that women across the world, and definitely in India, are brought up by parents believing that they have the choice to work or not. And that obviously has implications for how they then treat the rest of their life. And if we are going to ask for equality, then we definitely need to be willing to contribute in equal measure to this society. So young women, at least here, we are trying to inculcate in them the feeling that they have to be completely responsible for themselves. If they are educated and the system or family spend money on their education, that education has to reap very similar benefits. So young women have to provide for themselves and frankly should be very open and comfortable with providing for their families, for their parents, for their children, for their spouses, as and when required. So things are changing, and even as they change, many things stay the same. So, mindsets are very often used as a reason for slow change. We launched something called the Foundation for Working Women a few years ago, and the tagline for that foundation is change the reality, change mindsets. If we wait for mindsets to change the reality, we'll be waiting till kingdom come. So think about any legislation. If we had waited for mindsets to change, child marriage would still be legal in India. If we waited for mindsets to change, there would still be much more dowry in India. But you go out and change the reality. So legislation is a great idea, right? You change the rules on something, at least people become very aware that this is not something you're meant to do. When they stop doing something, whether for legal reasons or otherwise, then the reality changes and then mindsets change. So for gender issues, for equality, for women in the workforce, for women in society, and for patriarchy at large, I think we just have to change the reality and mindsets will follow.
Definitely. And Anirudha, I know that you and I spoke about this when I was in India last, and you reinforced the point that in your travels you were seeing that certainly both the reality and the mindsets were changing to a very varying degrees depending on where you went, rural or versus urban, tier 2, tier 3 cities and things like that. But I remember talking to you about the phenomenon of the mother wanting independence in their daughters. Was that something that you expected? Is that something that you see broadly, or is that pretty similar to my experience, which was that I'm dealing with upper middle class Indian young adults with means, right?
Right.
And education and all of that.
To the last part of your question, I think it's a much broader change. And as I said, and that's why I give the example of this whole skill training course in Orissa. Those are like courses over 75 days, that's all. These are all the girls that I met came from very poor backgrounds or just about lower middle income backgrounds, villages. They stay like about 3, 4, 5, 8 hours away from Bhubaneswar, which is the capital city of the state, and they come and do this. The parents, their mothers are encouraging them just to get out and make a life for themselves. They come out, they save for their marriages. As Anuradha said, they take responsibilities for their future. They are helping the parents actually repay their loans. And it's amazing to see that. and of what they are doing, how hard they're working to achieve some minimum goals in their lives that they have and the dreams that they have. And even during my travels for the book, there are a large number of instances where I can see that change. Talking about dating, etc., that you mentioned, again, it's such a diverse country that from one lane of in Mumbai to another, I can tell you a different story, and you'll find an entirely different story. So there's no one story which you can, or two stories by which you can paint the country. But I have to give an example of this girl from Munger, which is a town in Bihar, and more known for its gun manufacturing and also yoga classes than anything else, and tobacco. Now, this girl, I asked her, she had overcome extreme difficulties to study, and she was pursuing her MBA in a not at all well-known college in Patna, which is the capital city of Bihar. And I asked her, okay, so would you have, would you probably marry a boy in your class? And she said, no, never. And I said, why? And she said, it will upset my parents. And I told her, look, you have upset your parents for many years. They didn't want you to, or your larger family, your job, because in what is happening is the uncle and the father's elder brother and X, Y, Z, all kind of people can interfere in your life and take your life's decisions. So you upset all of them when you studied, and you fought with them to study. And how does it matter if you upset them one more time if you find someone you like and who is the ideal life partner for you? And then she answered back, this is a 20-year-old, or 19. She says, you know what, if I do that, then for at least many years to come, girls from my village will never come out, because everyone told my parents that don't let her go out. This is what will happen. And, and that will come true. I was absolutely stunned at that answer. Now, to go back again, another example was I was in Madhya Pradesh, which is right at the heart of the country. There's a place called Sihor, which is known for the wheat that it produces. I was sitting in a village and asking people what has changed. And we were discussing about the advent of television, color television, and dish TV, etc., etc. And I said, okay, so what's changed with this? And the village headman says, which was an old guy, that when we had only one television channel, which was run by the, beamed by the government, that was a government broadcaster, Doordarshan, we used to have this throughout the evening, this thing called agricultural programs, which we used to watch. But now with this dish TV coming in and the color TV coming in, we have lost control of the remote in the household. The remote has gone into the hands of controlled by the women in the house, and at many times the children in the house. So I said, okay, so, and what's changed with that? And he, in a colloquial Hindi, what he answered was that the girls and boys elope and get married. Okay, so this is also happening. This is heart of rural India and central India. So you can have the entire spectrum of things. And even today you will find, if you go to the matrimonial advertisements have moved away from the newspapers mostly into the online space, and you'll still find the obsession with caste, subcaste, etc., etc. So both of these are, today's India. So they're dating apps. Yesterday I was reading somewhere, and this has been there also before that. The media has done a few stories. There are apps which have come out which actually all they do is guarantee a young couple some few hours of privacy. So you book a room by the hour or by a couple of hours. And this is happening again in Delhi, in Bombay, etc., etc. That's also a part of India. And their colleges, what I was reading in this article, is where when you have some kind of a festival, student festival, competition, etc., some of the prizes given up are the coupons for this website.
Wow.
That's also part of young India. And now, are 90% of Indians part of that social revolution? Obviously not. But are more becoming? Yes. When these girls come out of a small village and work in a place like Bhubaneswar or go to Calcutta to work for a year, 2 years, 3 years, I mean, it changes. They're working sitting next to a boy. In a village, they could not have done that.
So do you think that this is genuinely new for India, or is this a different expression of Indian culture and its roots. Is there a precedent for this, or is this brand new behavior that's coming out?
Well, one can always find a precedent. You can go back and say, well, Lord Krishna used to, come up with a number of women, and you have this is the land of Khajuraho and, Konark temple, etc. So we have the Victorian morality was imposed at some point of time in our history, and this is not really us. And at the other end, you can also say, oh no, you know what, this is, we are very conservative, our women have to stay behind the parda, cover their face, can't show to strangers, blah, blah, blah. And this is all, Western culture which is being imported, and, this is a mad adoption without thinking of the Western culture. So you can argue either way, but this is a change you cannot resist. You spoke about, you asked me earlier about the book, and going back to it, to me what was fascinating was, what is driving this change. And the big role that connectivity has in it is amazing. It's television I mentioned, but mobile, the media, the roads, for example. I met this young girl from Nanded, which is a rural Maharashtra, who actually was working in Hyderabad. She came alone because she didn't want to get married. And how could she do that? Because 20 years back, she would not have been able to do that. All she had was, because her father or family that stayed in Hyderabad, she had been in touch with a few friends who were in Hyderabad. And because she had a mobile phone, she could kind of call them up and say, hey, you know what, can I find a job? And they said, yes, come over. And because of better connectivity, she landed up in Hyderabad, started working there in parents. And so urbanization, these are big drivers of changes which we don't realize. Similarly, for example, breaking down of joint families into nuclear families. For an urban woman in Delhi or Mumbai, the support of an extended family would be godsend, or if you're working. Because you won't, with the absence of proper childcare or reliable childcare facilities, if you have a young infant, you want someone like, whether it's a mother-in-law, some extended family member close by, if not actually living with you. But on the other hand, the examples that I gave you of Priyanka in Munger or some other girls that are there in the book, the larger joint family was taking decisions for her, and much to her disadvantage. With the breakdown of nuclear families, that decision becomes far more controlled not only by the parents, but within that actually the mother has a larger say in that decision. And when the mother has a larger say in the decision of the family, usually better decisions get taken, whether it's about education, whether it's about the future, delaying marriages, whether it's about letting the girl go out to work, etc., etc. And apart from the social change, you need to drive proactively. It won't happen by itself. It will probably happen in many generations if it all happens.
Anuradha, what do you see? You deal with some really intrepid young women all the time. What do you think is coming next for them? And what do you hope comes next?
I think the notion of financial independence is starting to seep in, and I think that's going to be the biggest driver of change going forward. It's interesting for us that most girls who come and are interested in our program, which is very, very focused on making sure that women who come here are interested in having full-time careers, they come most times because of their mothers, and the reasons can be diametrically opposite. One set comes because they have mothers who are financially independent, they work, they have a certain respect and stature in the family, and these girls see their mothers as people who in some ways have best of both worlds, right? They have a family, they have that life, and they have a career and the stature that comes with that. And then the other half of the girls come because they do not want their mother's life. These are girls whose mothers don't work, and even though they have respect and love and fondness and all of that, I think this generation is very, very aware of the fact that their mothers have not had the kind of respect and the kind of stature, the kind of influence, the kind of self-worth that they would have had if they had a life that was outside of just the home. So I don't think young women are walking away, or young men for that matter, from the joys of, everything that is personal and family and all of those things. But I think understanding that it comes at a cost, and at what cost is okay, is a much bigger question in their heads than it was for my generation or previous generations. So they are very judicious about the choices they make. Some of them still succumb to family pressures and families' expectations and sometimes societal expectations. But I think the notion of being responsible for themselves and actually having the choice at every stage of their lives is very important. Indrajit had mentioned. Anirudh had mentioned role models earlier in this call, and role models are a very big part of what we do here. Our scholars are exposed to women from every hue, pretty much every day of the week. Now, these women could be single, they could be married, they could be, from the development sector, they could be bureaucrats, they could be successful corporate women, they could be soft-spoken, they could be assertive, they could be dressed traditionally, whatever. But all I'm trying to say is it's a very wide variety of role models that young girls get exposed to. The common factor for all of them is that they have careers and they are successful. And we are telling our young women that you can have a family and you can have a career. You can also have a career and be single and still not be unhappy. And you can be, but a lot of the women who come and speak and have started to feel brave enough to come and say these things are women sometimes in their 40s who quit their careers. And they come and tell these young women that, I wish I hadn't quit. So the issue is not about not having a focus on your personal life and wanting all of the things that previous generations wanted. But at 40, you shouldn't look back at your life and say, I could have done more. So we are really preparing these women to do more. And I think the need for financial independence is going to be one of the biggest drivers going forward.
Well, there's a lot more ground to cover with this, and it's probably going to be something that comes up often on this podcast. It's hard to talk about India without addressing this really dynamic driver of change in the country. So I hope we'll be able to come back to it. Is there anything else that you'd like to add? Anything else that you'd like to say or to have people think about?
No, just sorry. Go ahead. No, I just want to say in wrapping up that I think women and young girls in India have been the fastest changing issue. They have changed dramatically in terms of their attitudes to education, to employment, to family, to careers, to children, to marriage, to work, to their own personal aspirations, all of these things. And I feel that nothing else has kept pace. Organizations, society, families, institutions, men, nobody has been able to keep pace with the manner and the pace at which women have changed in their attitudes. And I think that's going to be a very big driver of change, and it's going to shape pretty much everything that we see in this country and in the world going forward.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything that Anuradha has said, and that financial independence is extremely important because it just gives a choice, and which is why I've written about this in my book as well, that education and prosperity themselves do not seem to be driving a lot of the changes, particularly when social attitudes are concerned, and this whole gender ratio issue is one of those. But at the same point of time, education is very necessary because it gives the woman, the girl, the choice of having a career, of becoming financially independent and charting a course of her own. That's very, very important. And again, to highlight a change which I would have actually liked to refer to this earlier, we know about the services sector. So you mentioned, Julian, I think about the financial services, which is probably unparalleled in the world, including the developed world, about the number of leaders it has thrown up and across the public sector and private sector units, right? And across the entire spectrum of financial services. You talk commercial banking, investment banking, private equity, central bankers, everything. Women are leading like nowhere else in the world. And it just requires one or two leaders in the industry to just change the trajectory of a sector which is dominated by alpha males all over the world, even today. And on the other hand, is something like the information technology sector, which otherwise is very friendly in terms of the gender diversity, at the entry level, and even at the not at the middle management, but entry level, 4 or 5 years into the organization, over a third of the entrants are all young girls, young women. But at the top, you hardly find one single leader who is a woman out there. On the other hand, manufacturing sector seems to be becoming more friendly, and this, I've met people. For example, Siemens is a factory in Bihar, which is on the shop floor, they're 50% women. So GE has a factory in Pune where 30% of the workforce is women, and the shop floor workforce here I'm talking about. The story is the same with Cummins. And then the chairman of the Orissa Skill Development Authority told me a few weeks back that today a good manufacturing setup is actually more gender friendly than probably most of the services sector, which I thought was interesting. And my closing comment will be really, as Anuradha said, the girls have changed, the rest of the society hasn't. It's really the men who need to change their attitudes. This will be a far better country and a far better place to live.
Going back also, first of all, I'd love to leave it on that beat, but I just had to jump in and point out to my listeners here in the United States, but also in any other country that receives sort of the regular flow of our television here, and notice the effects of it. When I, as an outsider, observe what's going on with India's women and how fast they're changing and how fast their attitudes are evolving and their sense of self-worth and what they want in the world and how they want to be treated, it's faster than here in the United States when in the late 90s and 2000s when attitudes towards gay people started to change. That took about 15 years to get to the point where gay marriage seemed like a normal thing. It was a remarkable cultural shift, and that was regarded as very fast here. What's going on with India's women is even faster, much faster, and I wouldn't be surprised to see the country totally transformed in our lifetimes. It's just a wonderful, amazing thing to watch. So. To everybody listening, I hope you'll get out there and see it for yourself and cheer them on. And thank you both, Anirudh and Anuradha, for making time. It's been a fascinating conversation. I love talking to both of you. And we'll do this again, I'm sure, in the near future, if you'll do it.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure, and we look forward to the next time.
Marvelous. Thank you both. Thanks for listening. If you'd like to find out more about our events and get more global intel every week, sign up for our newsletter at getglobal.co.